thanks to the Spalding Symposium Organizing Committee for the kind invitation to present at this meeting and for the excellent work that they've done in putting together this splendid conference. I've been toying with the idea of presenting a formal paper, but I think the rigors of the semester have kind of prevented me from really putting pen to paper in the way that I wanted. Although the topic of death and immortality is a pervasive one in the central Sikh texts, and although references to these topics are for the most part very direct, having to present it as a succinct argument presents something of a major challenge, and not least because the themes that I'll be highlighting here, which you can see in the Prezi thing that I just put up, empirical death, deathless states, and rebirth, all seem to point in different directions. I'm going to argue that they don't point in different directions, that there is a continuity between them. So instead of a formal paper, what I'm going to offer is a set of talking points that highlight what I'd like to call disjunctive associations between these three broad themes. If my talk has some kind of a focus, it's to try and show, firstly, that these three aspects can be more usefully envisaged as different tendencies of a broader philosophy and practice of oneness, and to really understand how death, immortality, and rebirth work in the Sikh context. We actually need to complicate our understanding of time, and that's really what I'm trying to do here, is to complicate the understanding of time. In fact, these three tendencies are variations on an experience of time consciousness, which I'll be referring to as a kal, which is also the name that's often used for the divine, for God, but looked at it in a different way, from a different perspective. It is also an expansive time consciousness. Secondly, if we do manage to complicate our sense of time consciousness, it becomes possible to see that these three tendencies, death, deathless states, and rebirth, are also different ways of meditating on life, and specifically this life in this world. And thirdly, and this is, I guess, my ultimate aim, although I won't have time to cover it in this presentation, it's more for a follow-up paper that I'm going to be writing. I'd eventually like to place these ideas within the perspective of a post-comparative cross-cultural philosophy, which is something that I've been working towards for some years. So let's just dive into the presentation. I'm going to begin just by outlining some starting points. Let me just try and move this away if I can. Actually, I'm going to hide the video panel. There we go. There we go. So I didn't really begin thinking about death in Sikhism until the early 1990s. And in fact, I'd never really questioned popular opinion, which always seemed to be very pragmatic and attuned to the world we live in, even though there was a strong hint of a tension there between the idea of physical death, the finality that's associated with physical death, and a more metaphysical view on rebirth, transmigration. So my thinking on this subject really began in the 1990s, by the end of 1989, when I began to really make close readings and translations of the Sikh texts, particularly the Sikh scriptures, the Guru Granth Sahib and the Dasam Granth. And, you know, what I found was a pervasive emphasis on time and impermanence, time as impermanence, which seemed to be at odds with the kind of popular opinion. And I brought some of that perspective in to the teachings of the Sikh Gurus volume. Since then, I've tried to complicate that understanding a lot more. That was a first attempt at trying to understand what's going on. And the real opportunity for thinking about this topic really came in the Jordan lectures that I gave in 2009, which I've developed since then, but possibly even more so with an opportunity that arose in 2019, 2020, when the African-American scholar George Yancey, who normally works on race, issues regarding race, etc., was doing a series for the New York Times Stone column, a series of interviews on death and afterlife. And Sikhism was kind of slated in there. And over 6 or 7 months, we kind of developed an interview around certain questions that the New York Times had kind of laid out. Why do we fear death? Is death final? It's a very run-of-the-mill sort of set of questions. You know, do we have immortal souls, etc., etc. But right at the very last minute, once the interview itself had been written, George had passed it. It then went to the main editor, and he came back with some comments and said, "This is too esoteric. It's not really fitting into the kind of common sense that the New York Times audience is kind of working with." And right at the last minute, the interview was dropped and eventually published in a different venue called Tikkun. But it was an interesting experience because it really made me think about the reception of some of these ideas, particularly when there's a kind of a clash of ideas, a clash of schemas for looking at time, death, all of these topics. And what seemed to be coming out after the New York Times interview was really that what it found unpalatable was the twofold structure of the death event that is so central to the Sikh perspective. Also problematic was, you know, the idea of any non-oppositional consciousness. And, you know, it was either that or common sense. And common sense, of course, works within, you know, a very kind of linear cause and effect logic. And you just can't fit some of the ideas going on in the Sikh text into this kind of framework. And particularly if you look at the idea of the twofold aspect of the death event, there is both empirical death, which I'll be talking about in a moment, and also a more extraordinary death, virtual death, the dying to the self, basically, which leads to deathless states, and that in turn is connected to theories of rebirth, Avagavan, as I'll be outlining fairly shortly. So what I'm going to do is just dive into each of these topics briefly, but I would like to follow, to some extent, the schema laid out by the New York Times interview. So I've kind of carried that on into this presentation. So let's begin with ordinary death. And a good place to begin looking at that, for me, I was fortunate actually when researching this particular topic and this question to come across the writing, an article, a short article by the famous Sikh exegete, Gyani Sant Singh Maskeen, who, you know, lectured incessantly over a period of 30 or 40 years, very, very well known. He was trained in the Nirmala tradition of Sikh thought. And this particular piece is a 4-page essay in a book called Guru Chintan, which literally means the philosophy of the Guru. It's published quite a long while ago, but it began as a set of oral exegeses. Sant Singh Maskeen basically says, it starts out by saying how interesting it is that we ask for more life. Why don't we ask for more death? And, you know, why should that sort of matter? In fact, you know, the fact of death for him outweighs all other sort of objective facts about death. In the argument itself, and I won't get into it in detail, he links death to sleep and eventually ends up turning the whole idea about fear of death to forgetfulness of death. that what's really to be feared is forgetting death rather than death itself. Now, of course, Maskeen derives his argument from the compositions of Guru Nanak himself, for whom this forgetting of death can be traced to our immersion in a particular existential orientation towards time, which I will call, for the sake of argument, kal-centrism or time-centrism, ordinary time. Guru Nanak explores this existential orientation in a variety of different hymns, some of which examine the cosmology of Kal or Kal as a cosmology, and others from a more psychological perspective. In the cosmology hymns, Guru Nanak rejects the ontology of cyclical time associated with the 4 yugs, the 4 ages of the world, and folds the 3 first yugs, Satyug, Treta Yug, Dwapar Yug, into the Kal Yug, basically privileging the ontology of time associated with Kal as the favored ground of mortality, albeit as an ontology that is inherently complex because it's associated with 2 contradictory characteristics. So the 2 contradictory characteristics are, on the one hand, the forward movement of time, which produces the passing out of moments, passing out of existence of moments, which in turn favors the production of identity at the human level. And on the other hand, contrasting with the forward movement of time is the constant production of newness, of new moments, which are also in time. But here, what's coming out of Kal is also the production of difference. So this aporetic aspect of Kal Yuga, of Kal-centrism, if you like, newness, as opposed to impermanence, is nicely illustrated in a series of hymns, which, for the sake of this presentation, I'll simply call the 4 Watches hymn, which are written by 3 gurus, Guru Nanak, Guru Ram Das, and Guru Arjan, and they're placed in succession. And what's interesting about these particular hymns is the way they present the combination of newness and impermanence. Each of these hymns variously depicts the 4-stage drama of human life, starting with pre-birth in human form, and there's a reference here to what happens before birth. Secondly, the mind's loss of focus through attachment to societal conventions of childhood, its eventual acculturation. Thirdly, the unhealthy attachment to the world, to youth, to beauty, to riches, all of which happens in adulthood. And fourthly, old age and death. Central to this drama is the emergence and development of individual self-consciousness, which the Guru refers to as my nomadic traveler friend, Vanjarya Mitra. As the self develops and journeys through life, it creates attachments and involvements in the world with people, things, with beliefs. While these attachments give the self a sense of individuality and identity, ultimately this also serves to distance the self, shielding it from the existential effects of time, suffering, old age, and most importantly, shielding it from death itself. This doesn't mean that the nomadic self, the Vanjara, is completely shielded from death, nor indeed that it doesn't experience something of the pain of other people's death. It certainly does. But it does so in a way that constantly objectifies death, removes it from our sense of self. And this is where the forgetting comes in. Death comes, we say to ourselves, but not yet. There is still time. The point being here that our ordinary mind, in its state of everyday attachment, constructs an understanding of time as a buffer against my present time, in which I experience myself and the world, and of course, the time of my death. The mind does everything to prolong this buffer through a kind of forgetfulness of one's death. And what I've put here on the slide is simply ideas that can be extrapolated from a close reading of these hymns. So they're beautiful hymns, all of them composed in Sirirag, in the measure of Sirirag, which makes them very pensive in the way that they're kind of presented, especially when musicologists present them. But you can draw some really interesting conclusions, and some of them have to do with the nature of time itself. So for example, for the forgetting of death to develop, paradoxically, due to our method of, forgetting develops largely because of the way we narrate our life, the time of our life. And what this does is spatialize the thread of consciousness, which should be in time, but it's then spatialized within sequential linear time, which in turn contracts consciousness into isolated present moments. So the key thing here is that time in this particular mode, through this narration, self-narration, is experienced via the three distinct modes, Teen Gun, if you like, the three modes of time. And these three modes of time generate the illusion of both continuous forward movement of time and the idea of a distinct self. So from these hymns alone, you can kind of glean some of these very interesting aspects. And interestingly, if those of us who have done philosophy will recognize that Kant's first critique, is working on a notion of time consciousness. That's almost the polar opposite of what's happening here. It's the direct opposite of this. But this gives you an idea of how theories of time consciousness can be drawn from what are essentially devotional sort of hymns. And let me just go on here. So what are the effects of the Four Watches hymns? Essentially, what they do is they try to collapse the dualisms that exist and specifically weaken the logic of cause and effect. So, I complained about common sense earlier on. Common sense works within a cause and effect logic. That's precisely what these hymns are trying to deconstruct, is that logic of cause and effect. They also delink memory from the spatialization that's introduced. Perhaps most importantly, though, the effect of these hymns is that they provide a framework for, on the one hand, freedom of action. So it's clearly stated you have complete freedom of action within this time frame of Kal. But paradoxically, to exercise that freedom, and if you exercise that freedom, it results in a progressive contraction of the self, which manifests as the self's forgetting of a more complex and deeper nature of time consciousness, which I'm going to refer to simply as a Kal. So it's a double-edged question that comes out of this. How does one attain release from kal-centrism, which is obviously posed as a problem, while you still need to reside within Kal as well? It's a problem that sort of Indian philosophy has dealt with, I think, in different ways. But is put across in a very interesting way here. It's here that another important set of compositions provide clues to the way through this dilemma. And they point to a non-physical, incorporeal death, what I would call deathless states, essentially, which have the effect of turning death against itself, or turning ordinary death against itself. I'm just going to try and remove the panel here. It keeps coming back for some reason. So if you look at these two hymns, these are some of the hymns, some of the verses that are prevalent throughout texts like the Guru Granth Sahib. So here we have Kabir and Nanak, and I haven't named them here, but saying essentially the same thing. How can I die when I've died to myself? Everyone says he died, she died, but not me. Attain deathlessness by killing ego. I've kind of simplified the translation a little bit, but essentially that's what's coming out here. The impressions given here, and if we look at the verse below, which occurs a couple of pages earlier, we all grieve when others die, but I'd only grieve if I had to live forever. What seems to be happening here is a pushback against this simplistic idea of impermanence. And one has to question whether the deathless state is not the same as endless life. Clearly, it's not. It's actually a pushback against the idea of immortality within time. And just to go on, what I think is happening here, and the verse at the top here suggests this as well, where Kabir says, I don't want to die as the world dies. Both Guru Nanak and Kabir register a concern here to change the orientation of our desire from a desire for endless existence or kal-centric existence towards a deathless state that is also in time, interestingly, towards a deathless state that opens up an infinitely more expansive mode of time. So while there is a conventional death, which everybody fears, there is also a more authentic death triggered by dying to the self, by killing ego. And this authentic incorporeal death results in states of deathlessness or deathlessness referred to variously as akal, amritya, amrapad, and these there are other terms for these as well. So what I'm highlighting here is corporeal death on the one hand, and the suggestion of a more authentic opening to a different time frame, different time consciousness. Now, what I'd like you to take away is that while these appear to be oppositions or negations of time, certainly the ones on the terms on the right-hand side, this is actually a confusion that arises only if we treat them as binary oppositions. They're not binary oppositions. Rather, they need to be seen as disjunctive associations of difference. They need to be seen together from within the perspective that's opened up by dying to the self. So dying to the self is this mechanism which opens up a way of, if you like, associating difference within time and the newness of time, resulting in this mode of time consciousness, akal. So I'm just going to go on and talk a little bit about akal itself. Before I return to the main sort of discussion. So the word akal is a key term, perhaps one of the key terms in the Sikh lexicon, which in theological language signifies divine time, and has been simply used as the name for God in Sikh discourse, and in some senses quite rightly so. But at the same time has also been misleadingly interpreted as the one beyond time, or simply, as God. The problem with conventional theology, however, is that it not only introduces duality into the meaning of akal, but also diminishes its ontological significance by suggesting that it refers to something ideal, something metaphysical that does not belong to this world. From a philosophical perspective, akal signifies a time that is equally real, if not more real than kal, which is human or historical time. It refers to a mode of time that can be accessed only via expansion of one's consciousness, by shattering identity, by shattering identity frameworks, by killing ego, hence the reference to dying to the self, which is so common throughout Sikh scripture. So akal is actually a creative time. And in the, in the modern period, this is where we see this kind of religio-secular translation of Akal into something like a transcendental attribute of God, where ontology is now characterized on the definition of God as immortal, as eternal, as immutable. But all of this is actually within the Kal framework. It doesn't allow the sense of a Kal to really come out in the way that it should. So what I'm trying to get at here is that modernity has kind of framed a Kal within kal-centric consciousness by negating time, so that a Kal becomes a thing that can be brought to mind, even if that thing is an eminent deity like God. So God can be brought to mind. It's basically a humanistic perspective that's into which Akal is inserted. And some of this I kind of teased out in my the Religion and the Spectre book, but I'm going a lot further than that this time. So in essence, closer scrutiny shows that Akal is what we might call an expansive time consciousness, and it may help to just juxtapose what I've been saying about Kal and the Kal in this way. So if Kal is humanly constructed time as the sequence of identical moments, it's basically chronological time, and it's this chronological time that introduces space into what is essentially an inherently temporal consciousness. It introduces distance, and that distance is what generates dualism, the difference between, or the opposition between permanence and impermanence, external, internal, self and non-self, and what I've referred to as a contracted awareness, a contracted consciousness. Ultimately, this is what results in the fear of death. Akal, on the other hand, is essentially non-human time. It's often called divine time. It is an eternal self-differentiation, which means that time can exist within or in parallel to Kal, but it's a time that doesn't pass out of existence. It's eternal self-differentiation, meaning that it produces newness constantly. It's creative, it's fresh all the time. It's a limitless time. It has no measure. It's infinitely expansive. And these are all definitions of what can be termed essentially as the divine. It is without distance. Refers to pure consciousness, which sustains oneness, is absolutely interior, and most importantly, its mechanism of accessing it is through self-death. And it turns the entire question about the fear of death into a question about fear itself. Why fear death? And the states of consciousness that emerge from accessing the Kal are termed as nirbhav, nirvair. Nirvair means without enmity, without opposition, and nirbhav is without fear. One thing to note here is that although I've juxtaposed them and they seem to be opposites, they are actually not. And this is where the contradictions all sort of come in. And this is why the common sense approach of publications like the New York Times couldn't accept these two things being juxtaposed in this way. What I'd like to say is there's a way of understanding this disjunctive association. Another word for it would simply be oneness, or non-oppositionality. So the deathless state that I've referred to is neither an eternity in linear time, in Kal, nor a time beyond mortality. Rather, and paradoxically, this deathless state, whether we call it Akal, Amrit, Amrapad, is accessible only through mortality, meaning that dying to the self or self-death is woven into the temporal fabric of life itself. It refers to a form of time that not only brings death into the ego, into the I, at the very moment that the I is formed, but at the very same time, at the very same moment, time is also reborn and recreated anew. In other words, the self negates itself in the moment that it's born, and vice versa, is reborn and recreated in the moment that it dies. Notice what I'm doing here. I'm switching between descriptions of time and descriptions of self. They're essentially the same thing, just seen from different perspectives. My point here is that this akal is a time consciousness whose form is self-differentiation rather than the production of identity or identification. Akal can only be accessed or manifested through ego loss. In this sense, akal is not separate from kal. It does not transcend kal. Rather, akal is immanent to kal. They exist together. The two are absolutely and equally real. Akal inheres and subsists within kal, which is to say that eternal self-loss inheres within the self and within life itself. Akal and kal do not represent two different realities, but rather the oneness of all reality, even though that one reality is very often refracted through an oppositional time consciousness. And back to the self, a self that is in the world, yet detached from it, and one who realizes this is called Jivan Mukt, also synonymous with the term Gurmukh, one who has kind of been liberated in the stream of life. I don't know how I'm doing for time. I think I'm halfway, 30 minutes through. Thank you. Where are we here? After death. So my treatment of kal, death, ordinary death, and deathlessness, treatment of empirical death and incorporeal or virtual death, which is deathlessness in scripture, might lead us to conclude that this is still all within the kind of finalist perspective, that really there's just death. There's a twofold structure, but at the end, you know, there is nothing after this. But of course, in Sikh scripture, this finalist perspective is complicated by a number of verses and verse parts, which suggest that death does not end with the dissolution of the body, and that consciousness, as in some form of memory, survives the physical body. And here's one which is one of the more well-rehearsed ones. It's by Guru Arjan. Just going to do a quick translation of it. Coming together, we become separated. After separation, we came together again. Many lifetimes we've lived, only to die again and again. After each death, we began to live again. Time and again, we became fathers, sons, preceptors. Countless the species in which we took birth before coming to this body. And verses like these are often used as evidence of, you know, the reality of the process known as Avagavan. I wonder if I could just go back here. Let me just stay there. So, you know, what you can kind of take away from this is that Sikhism doesn't seem to have resolved the issue of death, immortality, consciousness. There seem to be two opposing perspectives, one to do with rebirth and the other to do with, you know, the finality, the empirical finality of death, even though that's complicated, as I've just shown. This contradiction, however, there have been attempts to resolve this. In the 20th century, even modernist scholars of the Singh Sabha period did not attempt to actually dismiss processes of rebirth, of Avagavan, despite reframing Sikh thought closer to a Western sort of theological perspective. So you find somebody like Dr. Bhai Singh, who is one of the leading Singh Sabha scholars, and wrote what I would regard as one of the great treatises of modernist Sikhism, Gurmat Nirnay, which means a treatise on Gurmat, the teachings of the Gurus, a text that was published originally in 1932. Jot Singh is important because he was also a leading spokesperson for modernist Sikh thought. But in chapters 10 and 11 of Gurmat Nirnay, he writes explicitly on Avagavan in relation to the theory of karma. And it's a very, very interesting discussion, far more interesting actually than some of the other stuff that he's doing in the same book. And interestingly brings the discussion close to modern psychology, but using Sikh terminology. And he actually makes references both to William James and Henri Bergson. And Bergson was also somebody that Bhai Veer Singh, who was Jodh Singh's mentor, was referencing as well, and trying to use in relation to understanding time. At the same time that he's trying to explain it, he's also grappling with classical Indic theories of rebirth, especially the centrality of the cause and effect doctrine. And I'm not going to go into any detail with this. I've spent several pages kind of discussing this in the book Sikh Philosophy, which is coming out in a few months. But what's interesting is his use of Sikh terms, basically terminology, particularly terms that have to do with the thread of consciousness, with memory, terms like Suchet, Achet, Achet Bhag, Chetana, the Antakaran, Sanskars, many other terms which I haven't put here. And what he does is tries to avoid a kind of a dualistic perspective, and refocuses the whole theory of rebirth onto the terrain of a non-material naturalism, which is essentially a kind of transcendental empiricist philosophy of nature. So he's trying to keep both empiricism and transcendentalism together in a very interesting and novel way. And this is why I think this particular chapter is more interesting than many of the others. And he's presenting key ideas, key concepts in Sikhism, such as hukam, which is the term for the creative impulse, the divine command, if you like, that's ingrained within all existence and all beings, and home, which is the sense of individuation. And he's trying to present them as interconnected aspects of consciousness itself. So in the end, the whole theory of Avagavan, of rebirth, is resituated back into this time, into this world, but within the time consciousness of Akal, with using hukam as an immanent force within life itself. So what's particularly noticeable about this chapter is the assiduous avoidance of any speculation on Avagavan as a process of infinitely prolonging life after death. There's virtually no speculation on that as well. If anything, all he does is bring it back to the locus of the body. He actually resituates rebirth into the workings of the relationship between body and mind, if you like. It's probably an easy way to kind of talk about it. And the other thing he does is interpret this keyword hukam closer to immanence than to theological transcendence, which is rather interesting, because throughout the early part of the book, he's situating Akal in a kind of transcendental fashion. The end point here is that he tries to free up human choice and freedom. So this is an interesting text, and there aren't that many which actually look at Avagavan or rebirth, but this is one of them. And so if I could just pinpoint, and I'm actually coming to a close in about 2 or 3 minutes, so I'm hopefully on time. Jyot Singh is refocusing on the body, or refocusing rebirth, the theory of rebirth back into the body, signals an alternative to populist understandings of Avagavan, where the mechanism of eternal return is identified as dying to the self. So this is absolutely continuous with what I've been saying earlier. The locus of Avagavan is eternal repetition, which also happens in this life, in this body, in this world. And that's the other thing which I should have highlighted here a bit more clearly, is that he's thinking about Avagavan as an eternal repetition, but within the framework of Kal itself. So he's actually really trying to resolve this issue in a very interesting way. And this is going to be my last slide. So my point here is that if death is not a return of living things to inanimate matter, then Avagavan as eternal repetition does not refer to cyclical deaths and rebirths of life forms through inanimate matter. Rather, Avagavan signals the exact opposite. It signals the death of kal-centrism's tendency to produce fixed identitarian form, and the tendency of the self towards self-production, if you like. So it has to die to itself. And the rebirth of difference and multiplicity that is life itself. So it's actually, Avagavan is actually about life itself, rather than a kind of morbid meditation just on what happens after death, or about death as such. So last point here, Avagavan as eternal repetition is an affirmation of the future as an openness to difference, by, in a sense, negating identity producing frameworks, and also an affirmation of this life here and now, and the life to come, over which we essentially have no control. The way that I've sort of framed the last couple of slides and 1 or 2 others is an indication that I'm trying to actually work in what might be called a comparative, but I don't like the word comparative framework. I'm actually working with post-comparative frameworks, and to work some of these ideas in relation to the thought of, say, Nietzsche or Bergson, Deleuze, in a sense, pick up from where people like by Jyot Singh, by Veer Singh left off. I mean, they opened this possibility of understanding Sikh thought, Sikh concepts, both within the Indic context, but also within the wider global arena of thought, which they were acutely aware of, but I think unable to really bring together. So I'm going to call it a day there, and I think I'm almost at 41 minutes or so. So thank you so much for listening. I hope there's something there that we can talk about or discuss.